You didn't become colder. You didn't become distant. You didn't suddenly stop caring. If anything, you became calmer, more measured, less pulled. There was no dramatic decision, no announcement, no confrontation. You simply stopped leaning forward. The urgency that once moved you, to respond, to reassure, to reach, to maintain, quieted. You still feel, you still notice, you still connect, but you no longer organize yourself around being chosen. And that's when something subtle begins to shift. Not just in you, in him. At first, it's barely visible. A pause that wasn't there before. A silence that lingers a second longer. A change in tone you can't quite name. You didn't accuse him. You didn't withdraw affection. You didn't create distance. But he feels something different. Because for a long time, your energy leaned toward him in a specific way. There was responsiveness. There was anticipation. There was a quiet emotional movement that made him feel necessary. And when that movement goes quiet, it doesn't register as growth. It registers as loss. Not necessarily of love, but of position. And this is where most people misunderstand what's happening. Because from the outside, it can look like you changed. But what actually changed is the structure that once made him feel central. You didn't become harder to love. You became harder to organize around. And the masculine psyche feels that shift before it understands it. What changed in you wasn't attitude. It was rhythm. For a long time, the connection between you moved like a dance. Not a dramatic one. Not theatrical. But patterned. He stepped forward. You softened. He pulled slightly away. You leaned in. He hesitated. You reassured. No one announced these movements. They were subtle, instinctive, almost invisible. But they created flow. And flow creates certainty. When a dance has rhythm, both people feel oriented. They know when to move, when to pause, when to respond. For a long time, your system participated in that rhythm automatically. You anticipated shifts. You adjusted your emotional tone. You stabilized the time when it wavered. Not because you were weak, but because part of you was still organized around connection as direction. And then something changed. You didn't leave the dance. You stopped compensating for it. When he stepped back, you didn't rush forward. When he grew quiet, you didn't immediately fill the silence. When tension appeared, you didn't smooth it over out of reflex. You stayed where you were. And in a dance that depends on mutual adjustment, that stillness is felt instantly. Because if one person stops overcorrecting, the imbalance becomes visible. Not created. Visible. For a man who unconsciously relied on your responsiveness to maintain rhythm, this feels destabilizing. Not because you withdrew affection, but because you stopped managing the tempo. He may not understand what's happening, but he senses the shift. The dance no longer flows the way it used to. And when rhythm changes, people often assume something is wrong. But what actually changed is that you stopped moving unconsciously. You are still present, still engaged, but you are no longer adjusting yourself to preserve harmony at your own expense. And in any relational dynamic, that alters the entire structure. And this is where Jung's map becomes useful, because what feels like a relational problem is often a psychological reorganization. For a long time, part of what connected you wasn't just attraction. It was projection. Projection is simple. It's when you experience something inside yourself, as if it belongs to someone else. You don't just admire someone's strength. You feel like they have the strength you're missing. You don't just appreciate their clarity. You feel like they carry direction you don't fully trust in yourself. Projection makes another person feel larger than life, more magnetic, more necessary, more charged with meaning, not because they actually are, but because they are holding something your psyche hasn't fully integrated yet. And in romantic dynamics, Projection creates intensity. It creates urgency. It creates emotional gravity. It makes the other person feel central. But when a woman enters what we've been calling the Sophia stage, something specific happens. Projection begins to withdraw. The qualities she once unconsciously searched for outside become internal. Direction is no longer borrowed. Validation is no longer required. Stability is no longer negotiated. And when that withdrawal happens, the relational field changes. Because projection doesn't just affect the person projecting. It organizes the dynamic. When you projected direction outward, he felt significant. When you unconsciously sought reassurance, he felt necessary. When you leaned for emotional orientation, he felt central. And when that leaning stops, he doesn't just feel a change in behavior. He feels a change in position. She no longer needs to extract something from him to feel whole. And when need disappears, role shifts. For some men, that shift feels clarifying. For others, it feels destabilizing. Because projection doesn't just create romance. It creates hierarchy. And when hierarchy dissolves, identity trembles. When projection withdraws, something very specific disappears from the dynamic. The unconscious reassurance. Unconscious reassurance is subtle. It's the quiet emotional confirmation you give without realizing it. The quick response to his message. The softening in your voice when he seems tense. The way you lean slightly more when he pulls back. The instinct to stabilize the mood before it becomes uncomfortable. It's not dramatic. It's not verbal. It's the steady signal that says, "You matter here. I'm oriented toward you. You are still central." Most of the time, no one names this, but both nervous systems feel it. When that reassurance is present, a man feels stable in the connection, positioned, grounded, relevant, and when it disappears, he doesn't always interpret it accurately. He feels something simpler. She feels farther away. Even if you're standing right there. Maybe he sends a message and you don't rush to respond with the same emotional tone you once did. You answer, but you don't amplify. Maybe he grows slightly distant one evening, and instead of asking what's wrong 3 times, you let the silence sit. You don't chase it. You don't fix it. You stay steady. In the past, you might have softened the atmosphere, shifted the energy, adjusted your warmth to rebalance the space. Now, you don't overcorrect. And in a dynamic that depended on subtle compensation, that stillness feels loud. He might test it, cancel a plan last minute, and watch your reaction. Take longer to reply and observe whether you lean in. Make a slightly critical comment and wait to see if you shrink. Not always consciously, but instinctively. Because if the old reassurance returns, the structure is restored. If you lean again, the rhythm resumes. If you don't, uncertainty grows. For a man who has not yet integrated his own grounding, that uncertainty can feel threatening. Not because you withdrew love, but because you withdrew unconscious positioning. He may become quieter, or sharper, or strangely more dominant in tone. He may accuse you of changing. You're different lately. You don't seem as affectionate. You're more distant. But what he often means is, you are no longer regulating the emotional field the way you used to. And when a woman stops regulating the emotional field, the one who relied on that regulation feels exposed. Because now he must generate internally what he once received from the dynamic. Stability, confidence, direction. If those qualities are not fully integrated, your centered presence confronts him with that gap. And confrontation with a gap rarely feels comfortable. This is why the tension feels confusing. Because nothing dramatic happened. No betrayal. No rupture. No explosion. Just a woman who stopped over-adjusting. And a man who suddenly feels something he can't name. A slight instability. A quiet loss of confirmation. Not of love, but of position. And when someone loses a position they didn't know they were standing in, the first reaction is rarely clarity. It's discomfort. And discomfort looks like many things: distance, criticism, control, silence. Not because the relationship is broken, but because the old structure is. Not every reaction to your stillness is defensive. Not every man experiences your centering as loss. For a man who has done his own internal work, your shift doesn't feel threatening. It feels clarifying, because when unconscious reassurance disappears, what remains is reality, and reality reveals structure. A man who is internally grounded does not rely on subtle emotional confirmation to feel significant. He doesn't need you to lean for him to stand. He doesn't need your responsiveness to regulate his stability. So when you stop over-adjusting, he doesn't panic. He observes. He may notice the shift. He may even feel the difference. But instead of testing you, he adjusts himself, not to regain hierarchy, but to meet equilibrium. In the same way that imbalance once created roles, balance now requires mutual presence. And this kind of man doesn't interpret your steadiness as rejection. He experiences it as invitation. Not an invitation to chase, but an invitation to rise. When you don't rush to fill silence, he learns to sit in it. When you don't regulate his mood, he becomes responsible for it. When you don't lean for reassurance, he discovers whether he can generate his own direction. This is the moment where many dynamics split. Because your stillness forces clarity. A defensive masculine sees exposure. An integrated masculine sees opportunity. And the difference becomes visible quickly. The defensive reaction feels tense. Subtle competition. Emotional withdrawal. Attempts to restore imbalance. The integrated reaction feels grounded. Slower. More deliberate. Less performative. You may notice something different in tone. He doesn't become louder. He becomes steadier. He doesn't test your boundaries. He respects them. He doesn't interpret your calm as coldness. He recognizes it as strength. And something important happens here. For the first time, the connection is no longer organized around asymmetry. It becomes two centers. Not orbit. Not hierarchy. Not emotional compensation. Two internally referenced people. And that kind of dynamic feels different in the body. There is less adrenaline, less urgency, less drama, but more solidity, more breathing space, more choice. Because when neither person depends on unconscious reassurance, the connection stops being about survival. It becomes about alignment. And alignment does not create fireworks. It creates stability. For some, that feels less exciting. For others, it feels safe in a way they've never experienced before. This is why Sophia does not destroy relationships. She filters them. She reveals which connections were built on projection, and which can survive without it. And that revelation can feel quiet, but it is decisive. Once this shift happens, the reaction doesn't remain abstract. It becomes visible, not in dramatic declarations, in subtle behavioral changes. The first thing you may notice is a change in energy. If he is reacting defensively, there may be a slight pullback, less initiation, shorter replies, a reduction in emotional intensity, not necessarily because interest disappeared, but because he feels less confirmed in the space between you. He is recalibrating his position. If he is integrated, the shift looks different. He doesn't disappear. He becomes more intentional, slower, more deliberate, less reactive. Instead of withdrawing, he stabilizes. Another pattern often appears in the form of small tests, cancelled plans, delayed responses, subtle unpredictability, nothing overtly aggressive, but enough to see whether the old rhythm can be restored. Will you lean? Will you compensate? Will you rush to rebalance the space? If you remain steady, one of two things happens. The pressure increases, or it dissolves. An insecure structure escalates. A mature one adjusts. You may also notice a shift in tone. Sometimes it becomes sharper, more critical, more subtly competitive. Comments that question your warmth, your investment, your emotional availability. But in an integrated masculine response, the tone becomes grounded instead, more curious, more observant, less performative. There is no attempt to regain hierarchy, only an effort to understand the new equilibrium. Perhaps the clearest difference appears in how discomfort is handled. A defensive reaction externalizes it. You changed. You're distant. You don't care like before. The discomfort becomes your responsibility. An integrated response internalizes it. I feel the shift. I'm adjusting. I'm noticing how different this feels. The discomfort becomes something he owns. And that ownership changes everything. Because once projection has withdrawn, the dynamic must either evolve or collapse. If he is defensive, tension escalates. Distance grows. Control attempts surface. Emotional friction increases. If he is integrated, depth increases instead. Conversations become slower but more honest. Silence becomes less threatening. Connection becomes less dramatic, but more precise. And at this point, something becomes undeniable. Your Sophia did not create the reaction. It revealed the structure that was already there. The shift simply removed illusion. And when illusion dissolves, the truth of the dynamic becomes visible. Not louder, just clearer. There is another layer to this shift that often goes unnoticed. When your unconscious reassurance disappears, the masculine psyche doesn't just lose confirmation. It loses reference. For a long time, your emotional responsiveness acted like a subtle mirror. He could measure himself through your reaction, through your tone, through your enthusiasm, through your leaning. When that mirror becomes steadier, less reactive, less amplified, he loses an easy way to evaluate his position. And that can feel disorienting, because many men are taught to understand themselves relationally, through impact, through response, through influence. When influence decreases, the question that quietly emerges is not always romantic. It's existential. Who am I here? If he has not built an internal answer to that question, your calm presence forces him to confront the gap. And confrontation with a gap can produce two opposite movements. Some men become quieter not because they are withdrawing, but because they are recalculating. They are asking themselves whether they can stand in this new equilibrium without being propped up by emotional asymmetry. Others move toward control, not aggressively, but structurally. They may attempt to reintroduce urgency, to create subtle emotional spikes, to provoke reaction, to restore intensity. Because intensity is familiar. Intensity feels like proof. If you react strongly, he knows he still has influence. But when you don't react, when you remain measured, when you don't escalate, the old feedback loop breaks. And that can feel like invisibility. This is the part many women misunderstand. They assume his reaction means they did something wrong, that they became too detached, too serious, too unavailable. But the discomfort is not about your distance. It's about your stability. And stability removes emotional leverage. There is also something happening inside you during this stage. Because when you stop over-adjusting, you don't just change the dynamic. You feel the silence. Without the adrenaline of compensation, the connection can feel flatter at first, quieter, less dramatic. And this is where doubt often appears. Was the intensity actually love? Did I lose something important? Am I becoming too cold? But what you are feeling is not coldness. It is the absence of overstimulation. When projection dies, drama dies with it. And drama, for many nervous systems, felt like aliveness. So when you remove unconscious reassurance from the dynamic, Both people experience recalibration. He feels destabilized. You feel less activated. The question becomes, can the connection survive without compensation? Because this is the real test of Sophia. Not whether you feel calmer, but whether the relationship can function without you overfunctioning. And many cannot. Not because they lacked affection, but because they lacked structure. When asymmetry disappears, only two outcomes remain: growth or fracture. And that moment of decision rarely looks dramatic. It looks quiet. It looks like tension that doesn't resolve the old way. It looks like space that no one rushes to fill. It looks like two people discovering whether they can stand without leaning. And that discovery changes everything. Sophia does not create instability. She exposes it. When you stop compensating, you don't destroy the structure. You reveal whether it was standing on balance or on unconscious imbalance. For a long time, the dance moved smoothly because you were subtly carrying part of the rhythm. You softened tension. You bridged silence. You leaned just enough to prevent fracture. When that leaning stops, the choreography changes. And this is where the truth of the connection becomes visible. Some dances collapse because they were never mutual. They were coordinated, but not equal. One person carried more weight. One person adjusted more frequently. One person stabilized more often. When that asymmetry disappears, the illusion of harmony dissolves with it. But other dances shift differently. They slow down. They become less dramatic, less intoxicating, but more precise. Two people begin moving from their own centers, not from unconscious compensation. And that kind of rhythm feels different in the body. It doesn't spike adrenaline. It doesn't create emotional vertigo. It creates steadiness. It allows breath. And steadiness is often misinterpreted as lack of passion, because many people confuse intensity with depth. But intensity often depends on instability. Depth depends on grounding. When you enter Sophia, you are no longer available for instability disguised as romance. You no longer mistake emotional spikes for connection. You no longer equate longing with love. And this changes the masculine reaction, not because you became harder, but because you became anchored. An anchored woman cannot be emotionally steered the same way. She cannot be pulled into drama to prove attachment. She cannot be unsettled into urgency. And for a man who has built his identity around influence, this feels like loss. For a man who has built his identity around integrity, this feels like alignment. That difference is everything. This is why Sophia filters, not because she rejects men, but because she removes unconscious negotiation from the dynamic. She removes the subtle trade of reassurance for stability. She removes the quiet agreement that one person will lean more so the other can feel central. And once that agreement dissolves, only authenticity remains. Some men cannot tolerate that clarity, because clarity demands self-confrontation. Others welcome it, because clarity allows real partnership. At this stage, you are no longer asking, why is he reacting this way? You begin asking something quieter. Can he stand beside me without needing me to shrink? That is the real question. Not whether he feels threatened, but whether he can meet equilibrium. Sophia does not demand dominance. She does not demand submission. She demands balance. And balance reveals structure instantly. This is why the reaction feels decisive. Because without unconscious reassurance, the connection must stand on its own architecture, not on longing, not on projection, not on emotional leverage, but on two internally organized people choosing each other freely. If that foundation exists, the dance continues, not louder, but stronger. If it does not, the dance ends quietly, not because you stopped loving, but because you stopped compensating. And that is not coldness. That is integration. You didn't become distant. You became centered. And not everyone knows how to dance with someone who no longer moves from lack.